Step with me onto the walls of Vienna, the morning of September the 12th, 1683. You have not slept. You are not sure you remember what sleep is. For 2 months you have lived on this rampart, or what is left of it, and the city behind you is dying by inches. Look at your hands. They are black with powder and pale with hunger at once. The bread ran out weeks ago, real bread, the kind with grain in it. What you eat now you would not have called food in July. Cats are gone from the streets of Vienna. So are most of the dogs. Below you, beyond the broken stone, the enemy camp stretches to the horizon. Tents past counting. The banners of an empire that rules from here to the deserts of Arabia. For 60 days those tents have crept closer, and under your feet, under the very wall you are standing on, you can hear them. Digging. That is the sound that has lived in your skull for weeks now. Not the roar of cannon. The patient scrape of men tunneling beneath the foundations, packing the earth with gunpowder, trying to blow the heart out of the city from below. Twice they have brought down whole sections of wall. Twice you have filled the gap with your own bodies, with rubble, with the dead. There are not enough of you left to do it a third time. The commander Starhemberg walks the line at dawn. He is as starved and filthy as the rest of you. He does not lie to his men. He has told you the truth. The city cannot hold much longer. Days, perhaps less. And then someone on the high tower begins to shout and point, not down at the tunnels, up, west, at the dark wooded hills above the city, the Kallenberg, where for 2 months there has been nothing but trees. There is something on the hills now, and on the highest point against the grey morning sky a single rocket climbs and bursts. A signal, a promise. You have stopped breathing. Every man on the wall has stopped breathing, because you know what that means, even if you do not yet dare to believe it. Someone has come. How close did Europe come to ending? We say the word Europe as if it were always going to exist, a fixed thing, a settled idea. It was not. In the late summer of 1683, the future of an entire continent had narrowed to a single broken city and a few thousand exhausted men, and the question of whether the Ottoman Empire would push past Vienna and into the heart of the West came down to a matter of days. For 300 years the Ottomans had been advancing. They had taken Constantinople, the great Christian city of the East, and turned it into their capital. They had swallowed the Balkans. They had reached these very walls once before, in 1529, and been turned back. Now they were here again, larger, better supplied, commanded by an ambitious Grand Vizier who intended to finish what his predecessors had started, to plant the empire's banner in the centre of Europe and never take it down. And standing against all of that was a city out of food, out of wall, out of time. What saved Vienna was not the city. The city was finished. What saved Vienna came down out of the hills on the last possible morning, an alliance of kingdoms that spent most of their history at each other's throats, briefly, desperately, agreeing to ride together. And at the front of it, a Polish king and the most fearsome cavalry the age had ever produced. This is the story of the Siege of Vienna and the charge that broke it. It is the story of how close the wall came to falling, and of what it costs and what it takes to make enemies stand together for one more day. And along the way, we are going to correct something, because the most famous version of this story gets one of its biggest numbers wrong, and the truth is more interesting than the legend. If you want the real history, the verified numbers, the human cost, the moments the legends get wrong, subscribe and walk with us. We tell these stories with the weight they deserve. To understand the wall, you have to understand the two worlds that met at it. By 1683, the Ottoman Empire was one of the great powers of the earth. It had begun centuries earlier as a small frontier state in Anatolia, and it had grown relentlessly into an empire that straddled 3 continents. It ruled the Eastern Mediterranean. It ruled the holy cities of Islam. It ruled the Balkans, the Black Sea, the old Greek lands, Egypt, much of the Middle East. Its capital was Constantinople, the city that had been the seat of Christian Rome in the East for 1,000 years. Taken by the Ottomans in 1453 and remade as the centre of their world. For generations the direction of history seemed fixed. The Ottomans advanced, Christian Europe retreated or held or bought time. The empire had reached the gates of Vienna once before, in 1529, under Suleiman the Magnificent, and been forced back by the coming of winter as much as by the defenders. But that had been a probe. The frontier had remained for a century and a half, an open wound running through the middle of the continent. On the other side of that wound stood the Habsburgs, the dynasty that ruled Austria and held the title of Holy Roman Emperor, the nominal leadership of the patchwork of German states. Vienna was their capital. It was also the gate. It sat on the Danube, at the point where the river road from the Ottoman Balkans opened into Central Europe. Take Vienna and the way west lay open, into Germany, into the soft heart of the continent. Everyone understood this. The Ottomans understood it. The Habsburgs understood it. And the man who decided to make the attempt understood it best of all. His name was Kara Mustafa Pasha. He was the Grand Vizier, the chief minister and military commander of the Ottoman Empire, acting in the Sultan's name. He was capable, immensely ambitious, and he wanted the thing no Ottoman commander had ever achieved, the fall of Vienna. Not a raid, not a campaign for territory. The city itself, and with it the door to the west. In the spring of 1683, he gathered an army that the chronicles struggle to count. The figures range wildly, anywhere from 90,000 to well over 150,000 men. The order of battle found later in Kara Mustafa's own tent listed a starting strength of around 170,000. Whatever the precise number, it was enormous, one of the largest armies the empire had ever put in the field, with siege engineers, artillery, and the resources of half a world behind it. It marched north up the Danube toward the city on the river, and in July of 1683 it arrived. The siege began on the 14th of July. Vienna was not ready in the way it needed to be. The Emperor Leopold I had left the city, a decision that looks like cowardice from a distance and like cold sense up close. An emperor captured is an empire decapitated, an emperor free is a rallying point. He went west to gather help, and he took the court with him, and tens of thousands of civilians fled the city in the days before the Ottoman army closed the ring. But not everyone left. The garrison stayed, and command of it fell to a man named Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg. Starhemberg had perhaps 11,000 soldiers, some counts, including the armed citizen militia, run higher toward 20,000. Against him stood an army many times that size. He knew the mathematics. He prepared anyway. He cleared the ground outside the walls, burning the suburbs so the enemy could find no cover. He organized the citizens. He readied the defenses for the kind of fight he knew was coming. Because Kara Mustafa made a choice early, and it shaped everything that followed. He did not throw his whole army at the walls in a single overwhelming assault. That would have cost him enormous casualties, and it might have worked, and historians have argued ever since about whether the all-out attack would have taken the city in the first weeks. Instead, the Grand Vizier chose the slower, surer engineer's method. He chose to dig. Ottoman siege engineering was among the best in the world. His sappers began driving tunnels, saps and mines, toward and under the walls of Vienna. The plan was patient and terrible. Tunnel beneath a section of fortification, hollow out a chamber, pack it with gunpowder and bring the wall down from below. Then pour men into the breach. For the defenders, this turned the siege into something worse than battle. Battle, at least you can see. This you could only hear. Through the long weeks of summer, the men of Vienna pressed their ears to the ground, listening for the scrape of digging, trying to guess where the next mine would go. They dug their own counter-tunnels to intercept the Ottoman saps, and in the black earth beneath the city, men fought and died in tunnels barely wide enough to crawl through, in the dark with knives and pistols and bare hands. Above ground the city starved. The food was rationed again, then gone. Disease moved through the crowded streets, dysentery, the constant companion of besieged cities. The walls came down in sections as the mines did their work, and each time the defenders threw themselves into the gap and somehow barely held. By September, the chronicles tell us, much of the fortification was rubble and the population was at the edge of starvation. Starhemberg sent up signal rockets, night after night, asking the same desperate question of the empty hills. Is anyone coming? For most of those nights the hills answered with silence. Here is the thing that should not have worked. The force that could save Vienna did not exist as a single army. It had to be assembled in a hurry, out of states and rulers who did not naturally trust one another. And the man who made it possible was not a soldier at all. He was a priest. Pope Innocent XI understood what the fall of Vienna would mean, and he spent the political and financial weight of the papacy to build a coalition, the Holy League. He helped fund it. He pushed, cajoled, and pressured the Catholic powers of Europe to set aside their endless quarrels and send men to the Danube before it was too late. The Holy Roman Emperor's forces gathered. The German princes, Saxony, Franconia, Swabia, sent contingents. And crucially, decisively, so did the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth under its king. His name was Jan III Sobieski, and he was exactly the man this moment required. Sobieski was a soldier king, a veteran who had spent his life fighting on the empire's frontier and who understood the Ottoman way of war better than almost any commander in Europe. He was respected, feared even across the continent. When he agreed to march and to take overall command of the relief army, he brought with him not only his authority, but the thing that would decide the day. He brought the Polish cavalry, and at its heart the winged hussars. Now, let me stop here, because this is where the famous version of the story goes wrong, and the truth matters. You have probably heard that 18,000 winged hussars charged at Vienna. It is in the songs. It is in the viral titles. It is a magnificent image, and it is not true. The winged hussars, the elite Polish heavy lancers, armoured riders who wore great frames of feathers rising behind them, numbered around 3,000. 3,000, not 18. They were the spearhead, the hardest point of the hardest weapon Sobieski had. But they were not the whole charge. The 18,000, the number that gave us the largest cavalry charge in recorded history, was the combined cavalry of the entire relief army. Polish, German, Austrian, riding together down the slope. The winged hussars led it. They did not make it up alone. I tell you this not to diminish the moment. I tell you because the real picture is better than the myth. 18,000 horsemen from a half-dozen quarrelling nations, charging as one, that is a harder and rarer thing than 3,000 of a single elite. The miracle of Vienna was not just Polish courage. It was unity, achieved at the last possible moment, by people who had every reason not to trust each other. The relief army crossed the Danube on the 6th of September. It began to climb into the wooded hills above the city, the Kahlenberg, dragging what artillery it could through terrain the Ottomans had assumed no army would attempt. And down in the city, on the wall, a man on a tower saw movement in the trees and reached for a rocket. Hold here a moment, on the edge of the hills before the charge. Because everything that is about to happen depended on a choice made weeks earlier and miles away, the choice to come at all, by men who owed Vienna nothing. If you want to support work like this, the verified history, the myths corrected, the maps and the full breakdowns, the membership link is in the description. It keeps these stories being told properly. Now, to the heights. The morning of the 12th of September, the relief army came down out of the trees. Kara Mustafa had made a second fateful choice. With the relief force approaching, he had to fight on two fronts. The city at his back, the army on the hills before him. He kept much of his strength facing Vienna, still pressing the siege even now, gambling that he could storm the broken city before the relief could break him. It was a gambler's position, and it left him exposed. The battle began in the morning and ground on through the day. The infantry of the Holy League, German and Austrian foot, came down the difficult slopes of the Kahlenberg and into the Ottoman lines, and the fighting was hard and slow and bloody, hour after hour, through the villages and vineyards on the hillsides above the city. The Ottomans fought well. This was not a rout, not yet. For most of the day it hung in the balance, the great army and the coalition tearing at each other across the broken ground. But all day Sobieski had been doing something deliberate. He had been moving his cavalry, the Polish horse, the German and Austrian squadrons, and at their core the winged hussars, into position on the higher ground, holding them back, waiting for the moment when the Ottoman line had been worn thin and pulled out of shape by the long day's fighting. By late afternoon that moment came. What happened next, around 6 o'clock in the evening, is the thing that echoes down 4 centuries. 18,000 horsemen began to move down the slope. It started at a walk, then a trot, then the full thunder of the charge, the largest cavalry charge in the history of war, gathering speed down the hillside toward the Ottoman army. At the point of it rode the winged hussars, 3,000 armoured lancers, the frames on their backs catching the wind. The sound of it, 18,000 horses at the gallop, the ground itself shaking, reached the men on the walls of Vienna before the riders did. The Ottoman line, already exhausted, already stretched, already fighting on two fronts through a brutal day, could not hold against it. It broke, not slowly. The charge tore through the Ottoman positions, and the order of the great army came apart. Once a line breaks under cavalry, it does not reform. Men run, and running men cannot fight, and the panic moves faster than any command. Within a short, violent span, the army that had besieged Vienna for 2 months was in full flight, streaming away from the city, abandoning everything. And they abandoned a great deal. The Ottoman camp, vast, rich, the supply base of an imperial army, fell into the hands of the victors almost intact. The artillery, the tents, the provisions the starving city had dreamed of for 2 months. And at the centre of it, the grandest prize of all, the tent of the Grand Vizier himself, Kara Mustafa, who had fled with the rest, leaving behind the standard and the trappings of his command. Sobieski rode into that camp as the sun went down. He is said to have sent word of the victory in words that echoed an older Roman line, that he had come, he had seen, and God had conquered. On the walls of Vienna, the starving men who had held the wall for 60 days watched the great enemy army dissolve into the dusk, and understood that they had lived. The relief of Vienna did not end the war. It began a different one. For Kara Mustafa the defeat was fatal, not on the field but after it. He retreated to Belgrade, and there the empire he had served collected the price of failure. On the order of the Sultan, Mehmed IV, the Grand Vizier who had gambled an army on the gates of Europe was executed, strangled, in the custom reserved for the empire's fallen great men. The man who had come to take Vienna left his command, his army, and finally his life scattered along the road back. For Europe, the victory at Vienna was the hinge of a longer turning. For 3 centuries the Ottomans had advanced. After Vienna, the direction reversed. The battle triggered what became known as the Great Turkish War, a long, grinding conflict in which the Holy League, now confident, pushed back against an empire that had seemed unstoppable. Hungary, long under Ottoman control, was gradually retaken. The frontier that had run through the heart of the continent began slowly to move south and east. It ended, 16 years later, with the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699, a settlement that for the first time saw the Ottoman Empire formally cede vast territories in Europe. The empire would endure for another 2 centuries. But the tide had turned at Vienna, and it would never fully turn back. The Ottomans would never again threaten the heart of Europe as they had on that September morning. The wall had held. And because it held, because a starving garrison endured 1 more week, and a coalition of rivals came down out of the hills on the last possible day, the map of Europe took the shape we would recognize. It is worth sitting with how close it was. A few more days of siege. A wall that fell from 1 more mine before the relief arrived. A coalition that argued 1 week longer and marched 1 week too late. Any of these, and the story is different, and so is the continent. We made something for the people who carry these stories with them. Pieces marked with the winged hussar, the riders who led the charge that saved the wall. If you want to wear a small reminder of the day Europe held, the link is in the description. Here is what stays with you, long after the date and the numbers fade. Vienna was not saved by a wall. The wall was rubble. It was not saved by a single hero, however much the legend wants one. It was not even saved in the end by the 3,000 winged hussars, magnificent as they were. Vienna was saved by something rarer and harder than courage. It was saved by unity, by enemies who chose briefly to stand together. Think about what that actually required. The Polish king had no obligation to die for an Austrian city. The German princes had their own quarrels, their own borders, their own reasons to stay home. For most of European history, that is exactly what they did. They fought each other, and the frontier bled, and the empire advanced into the gap their division left open. The Ottomans had always counted on that division. It was in a sense their most reliable ally. What happened at Vienna was the one thing the Ottomans had not planned for, that this time, at the last possible moment, the quarrelling powers would set the quarrel down and ride together. 18,000 horsemen from a half-dozen rival nations moving as one weapon down a single hillside. That was the miracle. Not the courage, there is always courage. The unity. And it almost didn't happen. It happened late, and barely, and only because a handful of people, a pope, a king, a starving commander on a broken wall, understood that some threats are larger than the grudges between the people who must face them. That is the lesson the wall leaves us 4 centuries on. The enemy at the gate is rarely defeated by the strongest single power. It is defeated, when it is defeated at all, by the willingness of rivals to stand together one more day, and by the terrible narrow margin by which that willingness so often arrives. The hills above Vienna are quiet now, vineyards and walking paths and a city that never fell. But the margin is still there in the history, for anyone who cares to measure it. It was days. It was always only days. The empire that broke against the walls of Vienna had taken its greatest prize 2 centuries earlier, when it stormed the 1,000-year city of Constantinople and ended the last living fragment of Rome. That siege and the emperor who died in its breach is a story darker still. That story is next. Click it, and walk